Hi guys, my name is Dr. Whitney Costers. I'm an English professor and I read for the AP Lit exam. So I'm going to give you some AP Reader insight that most students never fully realize until it's too late. I'm actually going to put you into the mindset AP Lit requires so that you don't lose time, points, and confidence. Because a huge problem that plagues most students is they go into AP Lit assuming the course rewards the boldest or most impressive sounding interpretation, or the one that feels the most emotionally perceptive, because that's exactly what got them the high grades and accolades in English class. Now, AP Lit still values insight, of course, but the exam has a much lower tolerance for overstatement than you might expect. So those who rely only on the habits that made them successful in English class, ironically, often don't do as well because they don't realize that AP Lit is asking for a much more restrained, text-bound kind of interpretation. If this is the kind of reading help you want more of, be sure to subscribe because my channel is all about AP Lit, AP Lang, writing, research, and literature. But the through line is always the same. Learning how to read language carefully enough that you understand not only what a text says, but what it reveals about people, emotion, power, and human experience. Because that kind of reading helps on the exam, and it also matters far beyond it. So one of the strangest patterns that I see over and over as an AP reader is students feeling most confident about the very answer that costs them points. As bizarre as that seems, it happens all the time, and it's part of why AP Lit can feel so off to students who are otherwise very strong in English classes. Because on the exam, the wrong answer usually doesn't sound ridiculous. In fact, it often sounds more literary than the correct one because it's designed to sound more psychologically perceptive, more emotionally complex, or more interpretively ambitious. And if students aren't trained in the exam's actual logic, they're going to trust those wrong answers first because they're exactly the kind of answers they've been rewarded for in English class. But AP Lit turns around and asks a much more irritating question, which is, can the wording of the passage fully support that claim? A lot of students don't understand this distinction at first, so they internalize the struggle by self-blaming, believing that they just don't understand literature well enough or they're just bad at analysis. And you can see the road that could lead anyone down, which is not ideal. What I want to make clear to you is that most students are not failing at the level they think they are. They usually understand the passage reasonably well. They notice important details and pick up on the emotional atmosphere of the scene. The problem usually appears at the next stage when they have to decide what the passage actually allows them to claim, because this is where an interpretation can start stretching farther than the evidence can completely carry. And a huge amount of AP Lit scoring comes down to this very distinction. For example, imagine one answer choice says, the speaker rejects her childhood entirely, while another answer says, the speaker's reflection on childhood contained both affection and discomfort. Many students gravitate toward the first answer because it sounds stronger and more emotionally decisive, interpretive, and confident, whereas the second answer initially sounds weaker because it preserves ambiguity instead of resolving it. However, AP Lit often rewards the second answer precisely because it allows the complexity of the passage to remain intact instead of simplifying the emotional tension into one clean conclusion. Once you can recognize this pattern, AP Lit is going to feel much less random. Many wrong answers are not entirely false, which is exactly why so many students are attracted to them. Part of the interpretation connects to the passage, but the reasoning breaks at a smaller and more technical moment. For instance, a word becomes too absolute, or the answer stops allowing contradictory evidence to remain visible, or the interpretation becomes cleaner and more emotionally satisfying than the passage itself ever was. Now, essays have the same problem. A student might begin with a strong observation, and the paragraph will initially sound pretty good, in that the evidence connects and the interpretation feels thoughtful. Then, 2 or 3 sentences later, the commentary slowly moves away from the wording of the passage itself and starts defending a larger interpretation that the evidence only partially supports. The student usually doesn't notice the moment this happens because the paragraph still sounds not just intelligent, but more sophisticated because the ideas become broader and more thematic. I think then that this explains why AP Lit feedback can feel so frustrating, if not totally empty. Students hear comments like, go deeper, or develop the commentary, and they think, I did develop the commentary. However, stronger AP Lit commentary usually doesn't come from making the interpretation larger. It comes from staying attached to the wording longer and noticing hesitation, contradiction, tonal shifts, qualification, emotional tensions, and places where the language complicates the easier interpretation instead of simplifying it. The problem is that go deeper sounds like an invitation to make the ideas bigger, so a lot of students push outward into larger thematic conclusions, when AP Lit often rewards the opposite move. The strongest commentary frequently becomes narrower, more precise, and more attentive to the wording itself. So you have to keep asking whether each sentence of commentary is still being carried by the evidence or whether the paragraph has started leaning on an idea the passage never fully proved. Now, multiple choice makes this issue especially visible, which is one reason I think AP Lit multiple choice can teach students a great deal about how AP reasoning works. Students frequently choose answers because the answer captures the emotional atmosphere of the passage, notices something true in the scene, or simply sounds intellectually impressive. However, AP Lit rewards the answer that remains most defensible from the wording itself. Let's then imagine a passage describing a family dinner. The scene contains warmth and affection, and the narrator clearly feels emotionally connected to the family. At the same time, there are awkward silences, forced laughter, and subtle details suggesting tension underneath the interaction. So one answer choice says, the passage presents the dinner as a joyful celebration of family connection. Students often choose this answer because the warmth in the scene is real, the family is together, and there are affectionate details throughout the passage. However, another answer says, the passage presents family intimacy as both comforting and strained. Now, this second answer is usually much closer to how AP Lit reasoning works because it allows the contradictory emotional details to remain visible instead of resolving them too neatly. The issue with the first answer is not that it completely misread the passage. It's that it simplified the emotional complexity of the scene and pushed the interpretation into a cleaner conclusion than the evidence fully supported. So this is why AP Lit can feel so punishing at first, and it's why it's so often misunderstood. So what can we do about it? After all, advice alone usually doesn't recalibrate this instinct. A teacher can say, stay close to the text, but the phrase is so familiar that students often think they're already doing it. What truly changes the habit is repeated review of almost right answers, because that's where students can finally see the exam's logic in motion. You start noticing that the answer you liked was picking up on something real, although one word made the claim too absolute, or the interpretation resolved tension that the passage kept open, or the answer sounded more literary than the evidence allowed it to be. And I think this is where AP Prep becomes especially useful if it's used in the right way. Unfortunately, a lot of students, though, do practice questions and then treat them like scorekeeping. They'll get 7 out of 10, check the correct letters, and then move on. But AP Lit improvement usually happens in the slower review afterward, when you look carefully at the answer you wanted and ask why it felt right, what part of it was still connected to the passage, and where it stopped being fully defensible. That's why in this video, I'm working with UWorld because their AP Lit resources fit this problem so organically, because they're not just handing you another set of AP-style questions to click through. Their AP Lit course pairs AP-style multiple choice practice with detailed answer explanations, illustrated study guides, video lessons on analysis and essay writing, and performance tracking, so you can build the actual reasoning that I've been talking about and not just memorize answers. The explanation piece in particular is what stands out to me because AP Lit so often turns on small interpretive differences. If you pick an answer because it correctly notices the tension in a scene, the explanation walks you through whether that answer also slightly overstated it, say by making the narrator sound more hostile than the passage actually supports. If you recognize irony in a speaker's tone, it can help you see whether the answer choice pushed that irony into mockery or bitterness when the passage was more controlled than that. And if you understand that a speaker feels sadness, it can help you notice whether the answer erased affection, uncertainty, or some other complication that was also present. In other words, UWorld helps you slow down the moment when an answer is connected to the passage for a while and then makes one extra interpretive move, which is exactly what many students miss when they only check whether they were right or wrong. Now, this skill carries into the writing side of the exam too. When you practice with study guides and video lessons alongside the multiple choice explanations, you're learning to recognize the same reasoning problem in different forms, making a claim, choosing evidence, and keeping the commentary responsible to the language. A student who learns to notice when an answer choice overstates a speaker's emotion can also begin noticing when their own essay paragraph does the same thing. What makes UWorld useful for this specific AP Lit problem is that it helps you review your reasoning instead of just measuring your performance. And as I've said many times before already, maybe you just keep choosing answers that are too absolute, or turning mixed emotions into one clear emotion, or treating an implied possibility as if the passage already proved it. Once you can see these patterns, you can begin changing not just your habit, but your mindset that so often interferes with earning a high score on this exam. So if AP Lit has ever felt weirdly subjective or frustrating, or if you've ever looked at a correct answer and thought, I guess, but I still don't fully understand why mine was wrong, I would recommend taking a look at UWorld. I'll put the link in the description box, and you can use my code Whitney10 for 10% off if you decide to check it out. The larger point is that AP Lit becomes much less mysterious once you understand what the exam is asking you to control. It's not enough to sound literary or know a bunch of devices or explain what's happening in a passage. The real work on this exam is knowing exactly how wording creates pressure, hesitation, ambiguity, contradiction, or emotional complexity, and how far the evidence can responsibly support the interpretation being made. So as you practice AP Lit, pay attention to the moment when an answer or a paragraph becomes a little too clean, certain, or eager to resolve what the passage is trying to keep complicated, because that's often the moment where the score changes. Remember, the goal is not to make your interpretation sound the smartest. It's to make it strong enough to survive the wording of the text. As always, thank you so much for joining me here. I do hope this video helped you. Please be sure to subscribe if you're interested in more help with AP Lit and Lang and just literature and writing in general. And thank you to UWorld for sponsoring this video. Be well.